the defending champion, the all-new Yamaha YZ450F.
What's up guys, Trevor Hunter here at Dirt Bike Tests, and today we are going over the 2023 Kawasaki KX450X. This is their off-road race bike, largely based off of the motocross KX450 platform with very few changes to kind of designate it as their off-road race bike. This segment's become pretty popular the last few years. KTM kind of pioneered it way back in the day, and in the last decade or so, a lot of the manufacturers have kind of caught on to that and now offer all of their own platforms in this XC race category, so to speak. So some of the changes that differentiate this bike from the KX450 motocross are pretty minimal, but they are something we've got to talk about. So starting off, it comes with an 18-inch rear wheel, which is standard for any off-road bike. It comes with a kickstand, comes with softer suspension, valving, and springs, front and rear. Kind of a little more tuned for the off-road setting. It comes with a 51 tooth rear sprocket instead of a 50, and the black mapping coupler, which is like the more mellow, smoother mapping coupler, that comes stock, although you still get the green standard and the white aggressive coupler as well with this bike. So overall, the changes are pretty minimal. This doesn't come with handguards, doesn't come with a big tank, which can be an issue for some riders. The skid plate is very, very minimal on this. It's something we replaced right away with something a little more sturdy and beefy, just to kind of protect the bike as a true off-road bike. But overall, yeah, the transmission's the same, the motor's the same, the mapping is essentially the same just because you get all the same couplers. But yeah, overall, it's still, just because it is very similar to a motocross bike doesn't mean it's a bad off-road bike, and we're going to tell you why. So starting off with the motor is very, very good. It's not going to knock your socks off, but it's also not going to disappoint you either. It's very rider friendly, a lot of usable power, especially for an off-road setting. You don't need some fire breathing dragging out there unless you're doing some fire road racing, then maybe, but even then this bike pulls pretty good. So starting right at the initial crack of the throttle, it's kind of our one complaint with this bike or this motor is just it's a little jerky off the initial crack of the throttle, kind of very responsive and crisp, and just almost a little too much, especially in an off-road setting. But even on the motocross track, if you're going through tight corners or ruts, or if you're going through rocks or tight single track, just the bike is very just jerky and can kind of get away from you and kind of upset the chassis a little bit. And so that's something you can kind of you can't really fix that with the couplers. Although if you do keep the black or the mellow coupler in, it kind of tames it down a little bit, but still not enough to really satisfy us with that. We've tried different exhaust ECU settings, and that's helped a ton eliminate that. But just with the three stock couplers that come with this bike, you really can't get away from that entirely. But as soon as you get past that bottom end is very powerful. You kind of lug it, not super low like some other off-road bikes, but you can lug it fairly well. Got really good usable power down low, and it transitions into the mid-range where it pulls really good, and into the top where it keeps pulling for seemingly a long time. So this bike has a very linear power, which is really good. Very, like I said, very rider friendly and usable. It's not super exciting, but it gets the job done, and really by the end of the day, you're not going to be disappointed. The bike uses the same 5-speed transmission as the motocross bike. So if you're looking for really low first and second gear, you're really not going to find it here. And if you're also looking for taller fourth and fifth gears, you're not going to find it here. So something we would like to see changed is either like a wide ratio 5-speed transmission, or more preferably a 6-speed transmission. Especially here on the West Coast, you can kind of run out of gear pretty quick, especially when you're riding in the desert and faster terrain. And then if you're riding in the mountains or some GNCC or anything like that, that first and second gear could be a little lower, kind of help prevent stalling, make the bike a little easier, not use the clutch so much, kind of just make it a little more off-road equipped right out of the box. You can mess around with gearing. So when you go to the desert, we typically run like 13 in the front, which is stock, and we drop down to a 47 in the rear. That covers the range pretty good. If you get into something super technical, you have to cover the clutch a little bit. but for the faster stuff, you don't run out of gear quite as much. You can get the bike into the mid to high 80s with that 1347 gearing, which is pretty fast. And unless you're on a dry lake bed or a really fast fire road, you're not really going to reach that too often. And that also allowed us to still be able to go through the tighter technical terrain in first gear without killing the clutch, running that 1347. And if you went to the mountains, kind of the 1351, 1352-ish was kind of the sweet spot for this bike. Like I said, it doesn't have the super low first and second gear, so you can be covering the clutch and fanning the clutch a little bit just to keep the RPMs up and prevent it from stalling. It doesn't have a heavy flywheel, and the gearing's a little tall internally. So just messing around with gearing really helps a lot with this bike, depending on the terrain you're in. Now, one of the downsides of that is it's hard to transition from tight mountain single track to the fast open desert without doing a gearing change, whereas some other bikes with the wide ratio tranny or a 6-speed, you can cover all of that with the one setup. So it's kind of a little bit of a downside with this transmission and this motor package, is that it's hard to transition from one realm to another without making any changes, but it's also very good in its specific realm while you're riding it, while it's set up for that. So overall, this motor package is very good. It's very strong, very rideable. It just kind of lacks that variety or kind of that large window of use that some of the other off-road race bikes do have. But it's also still very capable, and once set up right, it works really well in its realm. Moving on to the exhaust. The stock exhaust is pretty good. It's a little big, a little ugly, but I mean, that's not... I think performance over looks should be the main priority, especially if you are racing. But the stock exhaust is pretty good. A little loud, a little raspy, but the performance itself is pretty good. We haven't broken any tabs on the stock exhaust, and we've tried some aftermarket exhaust as well, with that rubber mounted, and we still haven't broken any tabs. So I know that can be a concern to some Kawasaki owners, but so far so good on our end. We haven't experienced that quite yet, and we don't really plan on experiencing that either. So moving on to suspension. Suspension is kind of where this bike lacks a little bit, and kind of for me personally, and a lot of the stuff we do here on the West Coast, the bikes, setting up an off-road suspension is very tough here in the States, just because you have GNCC and National Enduros, which are super tight, technical, slow speed. You want absorb the roots and the rocks and the slow speed stuff, whereas here on the West Coast, we have a lot of faster stuff. You're hitting big holes, big whoops, sand whoops, just a lot of high speed. You need more of a stiffer, almost moto valving to get the job done. And this bike, like a lot of the other off-road race bikes, seem to be set up more for the East Coast off-road. So for us, it's on the softer side. That is, you can go in the compression a few clicks, you can slow down the rebound. We've done that, and that helped a ton with just kind of stiffening it up. To keep from bottoming. We've added oil to the fork legs, kind of 10, 20 cc's to help bottoming there. And the shock, you can stiffen it up, slow down the rebound. All this stuff a little helps. And we definitely recommend riding with the stock valving for 5-10 hours. Break it in, get a feel for it. For a lot of you, it could be really good. For me personally, and a few of our testers here on the West Coast, it was too soft for us. But the components themselves are very good. You got the Showa 49mm coil spring fork. You got the Showa shock. Used to be valved and sprung for kind of for your weight and speed and the terrain you're riding in, and it works really, really good. So kind of suspension is very personal, and it's something a lot of people kind of change on their own anyways. But the stock suspension isn't bad. For us, it's on the softer side, especially for faster riders. We had a couple of vet riders ride it. And if you're in the kind of the tighter terrain, it really wasn't bad at all. But if you go on a moto track or kind of some fast, high-speed off-road, definitely you start blowing through the stroke. Kind of rides low, and the fork especially the bike felt unbalanced, and that the fork was softer than the shock. So kind of if we were running the stock setup, running the rear shock a little lower, kind of than normal, would help kind of compensate to get off that front end and kind of weight the bike backward a little bit. If we ran the sag in like the 104 or 105 range, kind of just put a little too much weight on the front end, which is already kind of softer and undersprung. for us. So just put more emphasis on that front end and rode lower, kind of just didn't ride all that well. So if we drop the sag half a turn or a turn out, kind of just alleviate some of that front end, and just felt a little more balanced that way. You also get a little more stability. This bike is very stable, one of the more stable bikes in this class. But yeah, dropping that sag a little bit helped there. We also dropped the forks to flush in the clamps, and that helped a lot as well. Just getting a little more stability out of the bike, kind of a little less, getting a little oversteer in the front end with the forks at the stock height. So dropping that flush kind of helped, kind of just more stability, a little better cornering as well. Kind of getting into the corner, I should say. Once you're in the corner, the other bike was fine, but just getting into the corner, we were struggling with the forks kind of in the stock height. So yeah, dropping those flush helped a lot there. Sag we typically run like right around a 106 to 108 with the stock linkage setup, and that seemed to be the sweet spot for a lot of our riders in the here out on the West Coast. Moving on to the chassis, this is probably where this bike really shines the most. It's just how comfortable and smooth this chassis is. A lot of 450s, they can be a handful, especially when it gets rough and off-road. You're hitting stuff fast, you're hitting big bumps, screw edges, rocks, roots, anything. Get the bike to get out of shape, get sideways, kind of just deflect, and they can be a handful. But this Kawasaki chassis is very smooth, very comfortable. The bump absorption is really good on this bike. It's probably one of the, like I said, one of the strong suits of this bike. So it's not the most nimble, agile chassis. It's definitely not the best cornering chassis either, but I think it has a really good blend of cornering position and stability, which most other bikes kind of lean on one side of the fence or the other, where this bike is very neutral in that it can and does do both pretty good. If you want to turn on the front wheel, it does that pretty good. If you want to turn on the rear wheel, it does that pretty good. Going across straightaways, rough straightaways, through braking bumps, the bike stays straight, stays planted. You don't get a lot of rider feedback either, which is very good. But with that kind of that more stable chassis, you do feel, especially when riding these bikes back to back with some of the other, like the Hondas and the KTMs, the bike does feel a little longer, kind of a little heavier feeling, a little kind of slow moving, which again, depending on the terrain and the type of rider you are, can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. For us on the West Coast, and me in particular, I really enjoy that feeling. I'm not a super heavy on the front end guy. I prefer to have something a little more stable, a little kind of comforting or safer, I guess, so to speak. And this bike fits the bill there. And I think too, kind of a telltale sign is when you rev this bike out. A lot of 450s, if you ride in the higher RPMs, the bike doesn't handle very good at all. They just handle worse and worse and worse as the RPMs climb. Whereas this bike, there isn't as big of a difference in how the bike handles as you rev it out more. So if you are someone that likes to rev bikes and ride it more aggressively, this bike responds to that really well. Whereas some of the other bikes, it's tougher on it, and it's tougher to manage as you get more aggressive on the bike. Another cool thing too with this chassis is the ability to kind of move the bar mounts and the foot peg mounts depending on how tall you are. So I know a lot of our taller riders, they like to put the foot pegs in lowered position, put the handlebars in the forward mounts, and kind of just open up the cockpit a little more. That's something that comes stock on this bike that really no other bike really has the foot peg design, and not all the bikes have the adjustable handlebar mounts as well. So that's pretty cool that it comes stock on this, and it really allows you to kind of tailor the bike to your needs and your specific needs. You can do just the foot pegs or just the handlebars or both, and they both have different positions in themselves. So it's very cool. It's very customizable for each rider in different sizes and riding styles, and so it's pretty cool that Kawasaki allows you to do that. And this bike comes stock with the Dunlop AT81 tires, and kind of depending, again, it's the rider preference, but the tires are a little stiffer in nature, don't have the best traction kind of out of Dunlop's range. So kind of we like to go to the MX33s or MX53s front and rear. That kind of helps smooth out the chassis and the hits a little bit, a little better traction. Again, that's rider preference. That is something we do notice with this bike and a lot of the other off-road bikes is kind of going away from that AT81, especially the front tire, and going to an MX33 or 53 or whatever your tire of choice is, can help improve a little bit more find a little more comfort and feel on that front end. Now overall, this bike has held up really well. The chain guide and slider after about 20, 25 hours, 30 hours or so. They were pretty shot. The chain guide more so than the chain slider. So those were just kind of easy consumables. Chain and sprockets lasted a little bit, probably 20, 25 hours before we had to replace those. But everything else really is working good. Valves are still on spec. Piston, everything looks good after 35 hours. Motor still runs strong. Bike starts super quick right away. And if you're an off-road racer, that is one kind of big thing with this Kawasaki is more often than not, this bike fires up really, really quick. I know by myself and a lot of the other Kawasaki riders and the dead engine starts, they're almost always at the front of the pack just because of how quick this bike fires off. Even against some of the factory bikes with 24-volt starting systems, this bike stock can and usually does fire up really, really quick. So if you're a racer, that is or can be a big advantage. It's kind of something to think about is when you're racing. So to kind of wrap it all up, this bike, like I said, it's very motocross based. You definitely feel it on the trail, on the track, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The transmission can be a limiting factor to some, depending on where you ride and what kind of racing or riding you do. But overall, this bike can be set up to work in a variety of conditions very well. As a West Coast off-road racer, this is one of my favorite 450s to ride and race. It's just so comforting, so rider-friendly, and I think that's kind of the whole theme of this bike. Is just doesn't do anything great and doesn't blow your socks off anywhere, but just does everything so well that it's kind of hard not to like and not feel comfortable on. From the power to the suspension once set up, to the handling, to just kind of everything you can fine-tune the cockpit. Just a very rider-friendly machine, and I think that's very important, especially with the 450. Some of them can be a handful, some can be tough to ride, tough to set up, whereas this is very easy to set up, very easy to ride, easy to go fast on and feel comfortable on. Just overall, it's a really well machine. I know we'll talk about this more in a separate video, but some of the mods, like just getting the ECU remap, obviously a larger tank, that's one of the first things we do for this bike since it doesn't come with one, is put a larger tank, handguards, skid plate, kind of finish off the off-road necessities before we really go take it off-road riding or racing. But yeah, it doesn't need a whole lot to really make it off-road racing. So if you have any other questions about this bike or any other bike, hit up dirtbiketest.com. You can find me at Trevor Hunter 224 on Instagram, or Trevor@dirtbiketest.com is my email. Hit me up with any questions, concerns, comments, feedback, whatever you want to do. I'm always open. I'm available. Check out dirtbiketest.com for more on this bike, more on other bikes, just all things dirt bike testing related. And yeah, so we'll do a separate video on this and kind of the build and a lot of modifications we've done to make it more race ready and suit it to more of our preferences. Kind of go through what we did and why we did it, how it responded, and kind of just where we end up overall setup wise with this KX450 off-road racer. So until then, we'll see you out in the trails.
If you liked what you saw in this video, come check us out over at dirtbiketest.com on the webs. We have bike tests, product tests, a lot of fresh dirt, and you can even support us by clicking through our links. Hopefully, we'll see you out in the trail.